The king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders concerning Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. The men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good tidings for my lord the king, for the Lord has vindicated you this day, delivering you from the power of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm be like that young man." The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
A couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of attending the Synod Youth Workshop in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with 4 of the youth from St. Barnabas. Now, to tell you the truth, before I left for this workshop, there were many things that I was dreading. Lack of sleep, missing my family, the plethora of contemporary Christian music that I knew we would sing, of which I'm not a fan, its emphasis on masculine pronouns, and a strange mixture of shame and blame and awesomeness just doesn't do it for me all the time. See, I was anticipating a stereotypical youth conference where hard faith questions and real wrestling with God tend to be consumed by simply singing them away with bright, shiny Jesus words. I think I was dreading being put into a small group the most, though. See, at Synod, everyone there, youth and adults, are assigned a small group that contains no one from one's home church on purpose. So the thought of having to live with, work with, and eat with a group of strangers for an entire week caused my stress level to rise. And I was the one who felt like a teenager. The closer we got to Tulsa, the more anxious I got. And I was wondering if they would like me, or if they would look at me as an outcast, a loser adult. And I would have to sit by myself at the lunchroom table all week. But day 1 of the conference had big surprises. Nema Cyrus Franklin was introduced as our keynote speaker for the week. Nema is an African-American woman who spoke not only of feminist theology, but womanist theology at a youth conference, no less. And yes, there were some pretty terrible songs, but there were some good ones too. Some that were even written by youth right here in Grace Presbyterian. And in Keynote, we talked about injustices in our society and God's love for all people. We even talked about injustices done to others in the name of Christ. And then we went to our small groups, and there were more surprises because I heard youth asking some serious faith questions. Why hasn't God been good in my life? How come God seems so mean in parts of the Bible? How can we believe in a book of stories to ground our faith when every other religion has its own book of stories too? I also heard youth really wrestling with God, with their faith, and with the church. I have friends that are gay, and I'm not sure they would feel welcome at my church, and I don't understand that because they're some of the best people that I know. The Bible seems to completely contradict science at times. My pastor says I have to do and say certain things to be a good Christian, but he or she hurts people all the time with their words and their rules, and that doesn't seem very Christian. I have a friend who's Muslim, and I have more honest discussions about my faith with her than I've ever had with anyone in my church. I don't usually go to church because it's not relevant for me anymore. And my friend who says he doesn't believe in anything at all acts more Christian than most of the Christians that I know. No glossing, tough words, real wrestling, brutally honest questions, sad realities, authentic emotional pain. When it comes to the church, many of the youth in my small group expressed genuine, heartfelt loss. At the beginning of our reading this morning, David calls Absalom a young man. But by the end of our reading, he calls Absalom his son. Absalom really is David's son, one with whom he had a major falling out. It's a long and complicated story, but I'm going to attempt to give it to you in a nutshell because it is important that we know the history that leads up to Absalom's death. In chapters 13 through 16, we learned how David served as kind of an accomplice when one of his other sons, his oldest son, Amnon, Absalom's half-brother, raped Absalom's sister, Tamar. Now, when David discovers that Absalom has been raped, he did nothing. He looked the other direction. He refused to see. And Absalom could not get over this injustice. He stewed on it, and it consumed him, until finally he plotted revenge. He set a trap for and killed Amnon. And then he fled. Now, David refused to see Absalom for years, until finally one of his advisors and a wise woman worked out a sort of reconciliation between the two. But Absalom couldn't easily forget what had happened. He was still angry at his father for not having a backbone. He was still mad at the king for refusing to atone for what had happened to his sister. So Absalom positioned himself to supplant David as king, and he won the favor of the people. He ascended to the throne, and then he continued to rage against his father, raping some of David's concubines in full public view to prove that there was a new king in town. Now, this is not a pretty story. There is deep love and loyalty and profound loss. There is hurting and violence and vengeance, sad realities, authentic emotional and physical pain, and genuine, heartfelt loss. Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. These words are most often interpreted as those of a father concerned for his long-lost wayward son. Even we as readers feel the longing for David and Absalom to be reconciled. But these words can also be interpreted as a good hand washing. The words of a man who's washing his hands clean of a mess that's out of control, a mess that he helped to create, still refusing to accept any responsibility. He's in your hands now. Do with him what you will, and I don't want to know about it. Everyone heard him say he was concerned for the young man Absalom, but he must have felt as if his hands were tied and he couldn't do anything or say anything that would change what needed to happen to get rid of the extra king. Why is this story in the Bible? The women in this story are used, raped, treated as things, collateral damage. The men in this story are selfish, absorbed in their own pleasure and vengeance. War is just beneath the surface at every turn. There is no justice, not for Tamar or the women of David's concubine. They seem to just fade into the background as if they didn't exist at all. The justice that is sought involves only the people who are involved in a struggle for power. And even then, the justice is meager at best. David's not alone in wanting to wash his hands clean, you know. Don't we all want to do the same? We want to wash our hands clean of racism, quick to send our love to those who are suffering because of it, their children dying in the streets, but slow to admit all the ways that we participate in a complicit society, including the ways we educate our children and draw political precincts and even access public resources. Sexism. We can all recognize it, but we are slow to remedy the years of history that continue to make women more likely to be victims of poverty and violence even today, laughing off structures that bind us as old boys' clubs. Ageism, holding tight to the things of our generation, lamenting the loss of the future generation's morals and ideas of sacredness, refusing to see with new eyes, while the young laugh at and ignore the needs of the old. And classism, that pink elephant in the room that we all know is there but no one wants to talk about. And wars, well, we certainly live in fear of that. Wars on drugs, wars for territory, wars for resources, religious wars, morality wars. I believe stories like the one about Absalom are in the Bible because they are our stories too. Not always pretty. Sometimes downright ugly. It's hard to look in the mirror and see that it's not always God that seems mean. Sometimes it's us. Too often we don't deal gently with one another. We kill each other. We hurt each other. We take away each other's rights. We can damage entire groups of people for the sake of getting even. And we can do it all in the name of God. On the flip side, we often mistake dealing gently with someone for not doing anything at all. We choose to live in an imaginary world where there are no injustices. When we say that we live in the land of the free, we don't see all of those who are enslaved. And when we hear that we are created equal, we don't acknowledge those who will never know what the word equal means. We can overlook all kinds of things and claim all the while that we are dealing gently with whoever we are desperately trying not to see at the moment. Somehow we think that by not dealing with these real life issues, that whether we like it or not affect our faith and the faith of our children, that we will resolve them, or at least absolve ourselves of their consequences. Ridiculous. Our scripture reading this morning tells us that the forest claimed more victims the day that Absalom was killed than the sword. More people died in the forest than in the war that ensued. The forest represented a scary place, a place where one could easily become lost and never return from the thick underbrush. It was uncertain. The forest had no paths, no roads, and one could easily become separated from the group and find oneself all alone. A place where they could forget that they were connected to anyone at all, where relationships between all that had come before and all that would come after seemed to disappear, where our own focus on survival can make us stop asking questions, stop doubting, stop sharing our fears, and start thinking we know it all and we don't need anyone else. Yes, the forest can claim more victims than the sword. And Absalom, well, he's hung up in the forest and yet killed by the sword. His head caught in the thick branches of an oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. What an image! Hanging between heaven and earth, not quite alive, not quite dead. The earth turning all the while, the mule continuing on in its work before Absalom is finally struck and killed. It's a sad story. Absalom was an easy kill, really, still seeking justice for a crime that he could not erase. Fixated on pain, bent on revenge, not knowing where he belongs, stuck somewhere between hating a king and longing for a father. Hanging between heaven and earth, alone in the forest. And David, the new old father king, hears the news that Absalom is dead from the Cushite, exclaimed as good tidings. But these good tidings were finally seen for what they are, not good at all. And David weeps, wet, hot tears. Would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. The cry of a father who refused to make things right, of a king who had attempted to swallow his guilt, of a parent with the late realization of a loss that had been evident for years, now made permanent. Sad. Sad, but this story continues. It doesn't end here. And God continues to work with David and his lineage, with these people, and through these people of whom we are appalled and ashamed, these people whom we love and we love to hate, these people whose stories are our stories, whose lives are filled with tragedy and outrage, sorrow, sadness, wrongdoing, and loyalty and love that are not always evident. See, we are graced with a God who can look at all of this muck and still see something good. A God that Will Willimon calls uncomfortably incarnational. A God in the flesh come down from heaven to trudge through this mess with us. A God who wants us to hear these stories, who needs us to comprehend the rage of Absalom, the hurt of Tamar, to suffer the voicelessness of the women and understand the thoughtless actions of Amnon, and even experience David's angst and guilt and heartbreak, not so that we can waller in it or be stuck in it, but so we can acknowledge it, so that we can name it, and then do what Paul urges the Ephesians to do. Be imitators of God. Not remain in the past, but decide upon God's new action in the world, because the wonder of it all, the hope of it all, is that God continues to imagine a different future is possible for all of us. And God continues to call even these people a people of God. Thanks be to God.